to Author Talk. I'm your host, Jim Dorman, and today we are pleased to have our guest, author Stephen Puleo, whose eighth book is almost out as we speak here today. But Stephen is an author, historian, teacher, public speaker, and communications professional. As I said, his eighth book, The Great Abolitionist, Charles Sumner and the Fight for a More Perfect Union, will be published by St. Martin's Press this April. And he will be appearing at the James Library and Center for the Arts in Norwell on May 21st, 7 p.m. to discuss the book. But we have him right here, right now. So welcome, author Stephen Puleo.
Jim, great to be here. Thank you.
It's so great to have you. Congratulations on your eighth book.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
So now it's just about out. Is this kind of like the fun time for you as an author?
It is. So there's the great research part, the writing part, the editing part, all very distinct parts. And now we're into the marketing and awaiting publication. So the book hits the stores on April 23rd.
Right.
So it's a very exciting time for me.
Right. And I think we have kind of a reader's copy. We
do.
An advanced copy, I guess. We don't have the actual printed copies yet. I'm just wondering, as an author, is that kind of like a special day for you when you get the printed copies of your book?
Very special day. I get them a little bit before they're in the stores, just a few days before. So it's very exciting. My wife will usually take a picture of me holding one, so that's good. And then even when the book hits the stores, this is my eighth book.
Yep.
It's always exciting. Never gets old. Love to go to a Barnes & Noble or one of the great independent stores around here to see the book. So yeah, it's exciting. Very much so.
We all probably use some kind of digital forms of books and audio books and things like that. But it's still nice to see it in print, isn't it?
It is. It is. Audio and digital, terrific, all good. But there is something about holding the book, seeing it in print, smelling the pages, and anybody that's grown up with books knows what I'm talking about. And I think books themselves, quite frankly, have made a little bit of a resurgence. So 10 years ago, 2012, 13, we were talking about the end of the book as an object with digital books and audio books. But I think that's reversed now, and people are reading books more. So I think that's good.
So exciting. When you go around to people like to get the book signed and that kind of thing, it's kind of part of the process, right?
Very much so. Every presentation I do, I've made over 670 presentations as an author in the last 20 years, and every single one has a book signing afterwards. And people really like it. Books being personalized, inscribed for them, for gifts, for family members, etc.
So 20 years now. Did you always think you'd be an author, or is that something that was a goal for you, or did you kind of fall into it?
I guess I would say I always thought I had one book in me. And so I started in the newspaper business, went into corporate communications, did some magazine writing, and came across the Molasses Flood story when I was doing my thesis, my master's thesis on Italian immigration, and said, I have to file that story away. I might want to do more on that. And so I did. I wrote Dark Tide. The book came out in 2003. It's 21 years old this year. That's astonishing.
It doesn't seem that long ago to me. I guess as we get older.
I know. And so that was my first book. And, The Great Abolitionist is going to be my eighth. Right. So very blessed as an author.
And I got to say, like Dark Tide was kind of the first time I think I heard about you. Read that. Read the Boston Italians.
Oh, thank you.
And that was eye-opening. I always wondered more about the North End and how it got that way. I think I read the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, and there was a lot of North End. Who lived in the North End.
Irish.
How did that transition happen? And so, the caning is. We'll probably get into we'll discuss more of that issue with Charles Sumner, but. So I just want to say I've enjoyed reading the books and making those things real. I think.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. It's to really get into the people involved and how it affected them. I think at one point the Molasses Flood was just so a nebulous a thing to me. Like, what do they mean there was a flood and how did it happen? But really, like hearing the stories of the families involved and how it took place and all of those things. But I digress a little bit. But
No,
that's just
that's
kind of the
fine.
process.
But I think your point is well taken. When I write history, I try to write in a narrative way, and tell the stories of the real people that are involved, and I think that kind of propels the history along. So I try to do that with all of my books.
Yeah. How do you get the inspirations for your story? How do you get to decide what it's going to finally be?
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things come together. You know, one, if it's an event, the event has to be dramatic. There has to be some compelling reason to tell the story. There has to be a big picture ramification for the event as well.
Yeah.
There has to be very strong, compelling, real-life characters. You know, when you write nonfiction, you need compelling characters just like fiction writers, except I can't make those up. These are real people. So you need compelling characters. And I think you need really good primary sources. That factors in as well. You have to have a way to verify this story. It has to rest on a bedrock of really strong primary sources. And so I try to put all that together and, you know, stir that soup, and then see if I have a story, if I have a book.
Right. Have you ever, gone down a path and decided it wasn't going to work out?
Yeah, no, I haven't. Not deeply. I mean,
Yeah.
I have a whole, as you might expect, a file of ideas, for future work and things like that. But I've never gotten, let's say, well into the proposal stage, which is how a nonfiction book gets sold, and then backed out of that. So I've been fortunate in that sense as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when you say primary sources, could you describe like some of those?
Sure. Diaries, letters. Sumner, for example, writes hundreds and hundreds of letters and receives hundreds. Government documents, original primary sources, government documents. So all of those go into that primary source category. And I when I talk to students of history or high school students, and I talk to a lot of them, always say that primary sources, the closer you can get to the event, the better, and to the person, the better. So it's not once removed with a newspaper story, a magazine story, a book.
Yeah. So just obviously people are no longer with us that those kind of primary sources are kind of hard to find. Would you consider like I guess not really, like another historian or something like that, or someone else who has studied would you ever talk to somebody like that?
Well, I would consider that a secondary source. So yes, excuse me, in a book sense, that would be a secondary source.
Yes. How about visiting sites where things took place? Is that something that you do?
Yeah, I do. I like. My wife and I often take road trips, historical road trips, and so many times those are tied to the books that I'm working on. Not all the time, but many times. So sort of physical sites, and whether it's Fredericksburg, as I'm working on this book, or Gettysburg. Absolutely, yes, that's part of the process too.
I mean, have you had any experiences like that with just kind of getting the feel for something? Like I in reading some of your work, I think of sitting in Faneuil Hall and kind of looking down at the stage and thinking about. Well, actually, one of the most recent things was really found astonishing was maybe thinking of Jefferson Davis giving a speech in Faneuil Hall, which I had no idea that he had done.
Yeah, comes up here in 1858 and essentially is trying to salvage the relationship between North and South, but it's a little bit too late, especially here in Massachusetts, in large part because of the person we're going to talk about today, Charles Sumner. So yeah, no, it's a. I think being in the physical place is really an important thing. You go to Gettysburg and you're in the place where Lincoln delivers the Gettysburg Address in the cemetery. It's very powerful. It's akin to, I would say, original documents, original letters. There's a big. When you read somebody's handwriting, it's very different than when you see it transcribed, I think.
And did you get to do that? When you said Sumner's letters, the actual letters themselves?
Yeah. So most of his letters are now on microfilm, microfiche. But they're still in his handwriting, which is, I think, critical. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you like?
Excuse me.
How were you inspired to write about Sumner?
Sumner, I think, is one of the most important people in American history. I call him in the book one of a handful of critically important non-presidents. You know, he's right alongside Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Susan B. Anthony, Martin Luther King Jr. That's that handful of people that have had enormous influence in American history, and Sumner is right there. And so I would say for the nearly quarter century he's in office, from 1851, he takes office in 1852, to his death in 1874, he is at the center of every major event in one of the most dramatic, dynamic periods of American history, and that is the 1850s, the run-up to the Civil War, the war itself, his relationship with Lincoln, the Reconstruction period after that, and this whole push for equality and civil rights. It's Sumner who leads that effort for that period. He's the most uncompromising voice, the most unwavering voice, the stalwart who believes in anti-slavery at first, and then after slavery is abolished, equal rights under the law. So it's not, there are other important people in this time period,
Sure.
but the leader of this effort, I think, is Sumner. He influences Lincoln in his beliefs, I believe, and brings the country, you know, along with him. So that's why.
Right. And he's kind of a polarizing figure in some ways, or he's I'll let you describe kind of his personality. But
well, he's got a very, let's say, prickly personality. Tough guy to be friends with. Not a lot of humor. Has a tough time sometimes reading the room. Let's use that phrase. Not the kind of person I think you'd want to go out and have a beer with, as the old expression goes. But he has a very deep moral character. He is firm in his beliefs. He's, I would say, uncompromising in a good way. He's unbribable. He's unbuyable as a politician, and he does these things at great personal cost to himself, both politically, personally, and physically. Eventually, when he's caned on the floor of the Senate in 1856, right. And he does it early. He delivers in 1852 the first major anti-slavery speech in American history, when he assails the fugitive slave law, and that's in 1852, okay. And he delivers the last major anti-slavery speech in American history in 1860, the barbarism of slavery. So in between, he is there, standing tall, I think, and he takes lots of slings and arrows during that process.
And unlike, you know, politicians today, or maybe politicians then, he seemed to be totally unafraid of insulting people. Even his people that he knew, or, you know, he kind of, and from whatever, you know, in reading your books, it seemed like even his own family kind of had kind of funny relationships with
them. He has a very standoffish relationship with his family. He has very few close friends. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is one of them, who's friends with him for most of his life. He has a difficulty with personal relationships. He grows up in almost a loveless home, I think. He has poor to medium relationships with his siblings. His sister Mary is an exception. She dies young, and he's very close to Mary. Mary's death affects Sumner in a deep way. He kind of rekindles a relationship with his brother George after many years of estrangement. So he has a tough time with personal relationships. One of his friends says personal relationships, you can talk to him for just a short time. You can only take him in small doses. Another of his friends talks about him not having a great sense of humor. So he said you could tell Charles Sumner the moon was made of green cheese, and Sumner would come back with facts as to why this could not be so. So he was not one of these people where humor and personal relationships came easy to him. And in some ways, I think that makes his political stance even more admirable, because people make fun of him behind his back often. They whisper about what a strange person he could be.
Right.
Yet he keeps at it. And ultimately, I think he stands tall during the country's most dire period.
Yes, and it was a time where people were trying to find compromise, and he was very uncompromising.
Absolutely. And what's interesting about that is, and I mentioned that 1852 time, so it was a presidential year, 1852. Congress had an agreement, because of the contention after the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850 was passed. Congress had an agreement in the spring of 1852 that the slavery issue wouldn't even be discussed. It would be, it would be too, it would just roil the House and the Congress too much in a presidential year. Let's stay away from it. Well, Sumner discusses it in August. He kind of says, no, we're discussing this. This is an important issue to discuss. It needs to be, slavery does not belong on a national stage. That, he makes this argument, a very, very strong argument, that the founding documents themselves should prevent slavery, are the documents that would say, no, all men are created equal means there could never be slavery. The fact that slavery is not mentioned in the Constitution in an affirmative way is proof that the founders did not want slavery to last for a long time. And so he takes this very radical view, which is the abolition of slavery at the time, and comes at it from a very conservative means, which is to say, our own founding documents didn't mention slavery. And there's no way that you can infer slavery, surmise slavery, conjecture about slavery, that if it was going to be allowed, it would be affirmatively in the Constitution. And yet, the Constitution allows no way for us to make a king, and it allows no way for us to make a slave. And so that's the argument he puts forth. It's a very compelling argument. He almost turns on its head the slaveholder argument, which is, hey, because it's not banned in the Constitution, it should be allowed. So Sumner turns that on its head in that 1852 speech. It's a very important speech.
What do you think inspired him in general? I don't think he even wanted to be a politician at first. He was an attorney, right?
He was. He did not want to be a politician. He makes a trip to Washington, D.C. early in his life, in his early 20s, sees the slave pens in Washington, the slave auctions. I think that affects him. His dad, who he doesn't have a great relationship with, is very opposed to slavery. That's part of it. But then in 1837, 1838, he goes to Europe, and he goes to England, France, Italy, and in many places, Paris first, and then in Italy, he sees blacks, African Americans, or not African Americans, but blacks in those countries at schools, at lectures, as part of the intellectual scene, as part of the discussion. And he even writes at one point, this kind of shows to me that the notion that we have in the American South that blacks are inferior is not the normal course of things, not the natural order of things, but behavior, learned behavior. And so it really affects him, I think, when he sees this, and he develops a very strong anti-slavery view at that point. When he comes back, the law is very dusty. He doesn't want to be a lawyer anymore, it's dull. And he ends up representing, in 1849, a black girl in Boston, Sarah Roberts, who was required to go to a white school, even though she walks past so-called colored school at the time. And on appeal, he goes to the Mass Supreme Court and says that separate but equal are inherently wrong.
Yes.
And uses for the first time equal justice under the law in the United States of America. So that's in 1849, just before he becomes a politician.
Yeah.
He sets the stage for things that wouldn't happen in the United States for the next 100 years.
Yeah, I was unaware of that, and I found that passage astounding, and I just salute you or compliment you on the way you wrote that, because it just kind of, wow, look what they did at that time, the same issue that was being discussed over 100 years later.
He sets that stage. Like I said, this notion of equal justice under the law is what eventually gets enshrined in the 14th Amendment. But his separate is inherently unequal argument that he makes, finally comes to bear in 1954, the Brown versus the Board of Education case. They use a lot of Sumner's arguments from 1849. So,
and also kind of frustrating in that the Supreme Court could rule against him with whatever. I didn't get too far into it. Whatever rationalizations, and then other court cases later on, even after his death, like Plessy versus Ferguson.
Plessy versus Ferguson uses the Mass Supreme Court argument, which says separate but equal is allowed. So yes, you're right.
But again, he's bringing that court case to life, and actually arguing with her father, I believe, right, who was
Sarah Roberts' father is who brought the case.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Well, he brought the case.
He brought the case, yes. So originally it's ruled against by the Boston School Committee, and then they go to the Massachusetts Supreme Court, which heard appeals at that time. Yep.
Okay, so they lost that, but does that kind of elevate his status as as kind of a leader, or?
Excuse me, it does. It validates its status as a leader, as an anti-slavery leader, an equal rights leader. And then in 1851, after the fugitive slave law happens, there's a very contentious battle for the Senate seat in Massachusetts, which, as you remember, the Senate was elected by the legislature, by the House, the legislature, not by the people directly. And during the fugitive slave law debate, Boston sends a fugitive slave back to bondage, Thomas Sims, in the spring of 1851. That leads ultimately to Sumner's election on the 26th ballot. Dark horse candidate, radical candidate, not really the candidate of choice of the Boston merchants and kind of the merchant class.
And what was his party?
His party at that time was Free Soilers. Right. And then after he's elected, right around 1854, of course, he's one of the founders of the Republican Party, the anti-slavery Republican Party, which eventually elects Lincoln in 1860. So.
And even though I think I knew this, obviously Lincoln was a Republican, but I think reading your books and kind of as you're reading, it's almost like you think the Republicans are the Democrats and the Democrats are the Republicans. But that the Republican Party was founded on anti-slavery.
Yeah, totally founded on
anti-slavery. That's what it was. So, and then later on, we're kind of fighting against the conservative Democrats of the South.
Right. So it's the Democratic Party that is looking to hold on to slavery.
Right.
That is in favor of Jim Crow. The Republicans fight against that all the way through. And it's astonishing, the debates that get held. I mean, we think about debates today, and I'm not saying they're not important debates. You debate healthcare, you debate taxes, you debate, whatever, immigration. Then we were debating, can one person be owned by another? Can one person's children be sold to another owner?
Yes.
It's astonishing the kind of debates that were held in Congress at the time.
And we've gotten into some of the detail, but I think for some people, if they know of Charles Sumner at this point, a lot of people may know of the caning and what took place. They may think he's named the bridge. I mean, the tunnel is named after him, but it's not.
It is not. It is not. It's named after a general in the War of 1812. So yes.
Are they related at all?
They're not.
No, not at all. Okay. But they may know of the caning, and you wrote a whole book about the caning.
Right.
And so, could you kind of describe that a little bit to us? And also, I'm kind of interested in how why you decided that you wanted to write a whole book about Charles Sumner after writing the Caning.
Sure, the caning happens in 1856. So Sumner, picture this: the Kansas is in the middle of a lot of violence. You have pro-slavery forces, anti-slavery forces, competing governments. There's blood in Kansas, bleeding Kansas, as it was called, in 1855, early 1856. Sumner delivers a major speech called "The Crime Against Kansas" on May 19th of 1856. In that speech, he not only decries the violence, not only decries slavery, not only decries the South and South Carolina in particular, but he personally attacks Andrew Butler, who's a senator from South Carolina. Insults him, talks to him about that his mistress is the harlot, slavery. Andrew Butler had recently had a stroke, and part of his face was paralyzed. He had a difficult time speaking. Sumner makes fun of that in a personal way. So he gives a 5-hour speech over 2 days, and most of it is so compelling about the Kansas situation, about the slavery situation, but there are all these personal attacks. This infuriates the South, infuriates particularly the congressman from South Carolina, Preston Brooks, who is the second cousin of Andrew Butler. Brooks, wrestles with, what do I do about this? How do I redeem, the pride of the South? How do I avenge my kin? Eventually decides that Sumner needs to be given a beating. And so on May 22nd, 1856, the Senate is out of session, but Sumner is up front, signing things, working on documents. Brooks enters the Senate chamber with one of his South Carolina congressional colleagues, waits for a little bit of time, then walks up to the front and says, "Mr. Sumner," and Sumner looks up from his desk and he says, "I have read your speech over twice. It is a libel against my state and my kin," and smashes Sumner on the head with a cane, and Sumner's head erupts in blood, and Preston Brooks then begins to beat him senseless for probably a period of about 90 seconds to 2 minutes. Hurts him badly, probably fractures his skull, probably causes spinal injuries, PTSD issues, brain trauma, etc. And Sumner is finally left gasping in a pool of his own blood, and just before he loses consciousness, he says, "I can't believe such a thing like this was possible." Right. And so the caning ripples across the country. The North is outraged. The South is pleased that Sumner, an abolitionist, was finally given his due. The two regions react totally differently. The Republican Party membership soars after Sumner has to leave the Senate for what would become 3 years. But that summer of 1856, Republican membership really soars. Sumner's vacant chair speaks volumes. And so it really is the moment, I think, that the slavery debate is taken from an academic debate, an intellectual debate, a political debate, to this really visceral, emotional debate between North and South. And there was no turning back at that point. It's still 5 years until war begins, but I think every event that happens subsequently really comes from that moment that Sumner is beaten.
Kind of really defines this divisiveness, and to read the different accounts of what people think of what took place or what they think about it is just, it kind of reminds me of some things I read today. But
I think what you saw is you had the South celebrating. In fact, many of them giving gifts of canes to Sumner that were to Brooks, inscribed, "Hit him again." And in the North, you had moderates who really were not supporters of Sumner. They thought Sumner was too radical. But these moderates were really left with nowhere else to go but to support Sumner. And sort of by extension, to support the anti-slavery cause. That's what happens. I think
So
the
kinda
biggest impact of the caning to me was the impact on northern moderates.
Right.
In my view.
Right. Yeah. That's a great point. But reading it again, it made me not realize that it wasn't like a spur of the moment type of thing. It was planned out.
Well, it's played out for a short time though. So Brooks hears the first day of Sumner's speech, May 19th, reads the second part. He's not in the chamber for May 20th. Debates about what to do for a day and a half, and then does the caning on May 22nd. Right. So it's planned, it's premeditated for sure, but it's this Brooks is wrestling. How do I do this?
Right. It made me think about he had been involved in a duel at one time, but that kind of mentality of that, like if you've been insulted, your honor has been besmirched in some way, then you're gonna. Your reputation might be at stake, or you feel like you need to act in some way. Maybe that's what I took out. One of the things that I took out of it. It's kind of a little bit foreign to us in modern times, I guess.
I think
things have changed,
and I think it really was the Southern code of honor that he grew up with. And you're right. He's involved in a duel in the 1840s. One of the reasons he used a cane was because he was wounded in that duel.
Okay.
And he's almost the way he grew up, the way that Southern code of honor was part and parcel of that society. He was almost compelled to do something to avenge the honor of his region and his relative. That's the way he viewed it.
Yes, it was something like that seems to have fallen behind us. I'm not sure. I hope so. But I did read some things about Edgefield, where he came from. That seemed to be a thing.
I think it's the whole South. But Edgefield, you're right. Edgefield's probably the most pro-slavery county in South Carolina. South Carolina probably the most pro-slavery state. It secedes first after Lincoln's elected in 1860. Kind of leads the way in that sense.
They have kind of all-star plantation owners, and
they have big plantation owners.
Strom Thurmond, I think.
Well, but
that's a little later.
Right, but in the moment they have John C. Calhoun, who's a nullification guy. Who's he's a giant in the Senate. There's no question about that regionally. Him, Daniel Webster from Massachusetts, Henry Clay from Kentucky. These are the great giant senators, whose voices were heard around the country. But Calhoun is a South Carolina leader.
Right.
And
I read a recent current statement from Edgefield Historical Society, basically saying it was not a white man's issue; it's a world issue. Slavery wasn't that. I was just a bit taken aback by not that, but it's not your work. But but just kind of saying. That's not you can't just isolate what the things that were done, and then for slavery that these other people had other accomplishments, and if you read the bios, they don't mention anything about what they did in slavery.
Okay, are you saying in the Edgefield Historical Society?
Okay. So, sorry, Edgefield Historical Society, but I was a little bit taken back by the descriptions of.
Although I've been to Edgefield and have been to the town, have been to the courthouse where the Preston Brooks documents have been to the former site of his plantation. They're well aware of the history. They see Civil War history. They know it. They're not huge fans of Sumner. I'm not saying that, but they are well aware of the history. I can tell you that. Yes.
Okay. Anyway, but back to what we originally wanted to was thinking about. But it was just what galvanized your idea that you wanted to write an entire biography.
Right. So the more I learned about Sumner, the more I wanted to learn about him, and I felt like that his story needed to be told. The last full biography on Sumner is over 50 years ago. David Donald actually wrote a 2-volume biography, one in 1960, one in 1970, on Sumner. There had been really no good treatment full treatment of him. There had been small works that were done about him, but no real full treatment of him. And I just felt like the more research I did, the caning essentially stops with the start of the war. The secession of the South, and the more research I did, the more I saw how much Sumner influenced Lincoln, the relationship between the two of them. That Sumner really moved Lincoln to this strong anti-slavery position. Lincoln doesn't start that way, doesn't really get to that point until late 1861, early 1862, right in that period of time. Sumner's responsible for that. Sumner's work in Reconstruction is astonishing. The Freedmen's Bureau he wants to set up to protect freed slaves. The Reconstruction Amendments which is the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, he works very hard on, although he's not fully convinced you even need an amendment at the outset, because he feels like, again, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are sufficient for Congress to just pass a law abolishing slavery. But he eventually says, okay, we probably should have an amendment to the Constitution. For future generations. It would make it more difficult for that law to be repealed, for example. Right. But his work on the Reconstruction Amendments and during Reconstruction is just amazing. He again brings the country forward. So that's the thing that you notice about him for almost his entire career, is that he pulls people and he pulls a nation towards his view, which is an anti-slavery view and an equal rights view under the law. So, and as I said, he does it with resistance the whole way, or much of the way, but he never gives up.
Do you think you found out new things in your research for the second book?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I would say the Lincoln-Sumner relationship, which when you read the opening of the book, it's at Lincoln's. The prologue is at Lincoln's funeral. Yes. Sumner is at his bedside, not his funeral, but the night he is shot. Their relationship is really interesting. At the very beginning, Sumner's not sure Lincoln is a strong enough anti-slavery person to carry the Republican banner. On the other hand, Lincoln believes Sumner is imperious, a little bit of a snob. So they clash a bit, but very quickly, they begin to warm to each other, I think. And as I said, Sumner has a great deal of influence on Lincoln in terms of the anti-slavery views. Lincoln has influence on Sumner on the political necessities that need to be taken into consideration as he's trying to do this. One of the examples during the Emancipation Proclamation, which Sumner pushes Lincoln to issue much earlier. Lincoln says, I want to wait until we have some kind of a win on the battlefield. Like there's a place for this momentum to happen. And so it's Antietam, which isn't a great win. It's almost a draw between North and South, but it's, let's say, a slight win for the North. And it's not till after Antietam that Lincoln announces in September of 1862, okay, Emancipation Proclamation is going to take effect on January 1st of 1863. Sumner doesn't think of those considerations. Lincoln says, I think that's really important. Sumner is not happy that Lincoln only restrains the Emancipation Proclamation to southern states in rebellion. The border states in the North, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, the border states in the North, they're slave-holding states, but Lincoln does not free the slaves in those states. And Lincoln doesn't do it because he feels as though if he does, he would lose those border states. And as Lincoln said, I hope God is on my side in this effort, but I must have Kentucky on my side. Kentucky had farmland, factories, it was the gateway to the North, and so he risked alienating Kentucky and thus losing them to the Confederacy perhaps, if he included the border states' slaves to be free. And so Sumner at first balks at that, but then kind of gets it, Okay, we have to do it this way so that we can maintain the Union. So those
Right.
those are the kind of
Yeah.
things that are fascinating to me,
Yeah.
the way those two men interacted.
And I loved. I mean, well, I think you had that scene of Lincoln's death in the prologue.
Yeah.
And I've been there, where, to see the bed and the bloody pillow, I think, or,
Yeah.
if I remember right,
Right.
which is pretty compelling. And to know that Charles Sumner was there, that's pretty important. And it was a good illustration of their their relationship. But they had a strong relationship. And how devastating that time was, the momentous, I guess, every
so.
year right through and going into Reconstruction, which I don't think maybe everyone realizes how brutal, that time was too.
Yeah, I mean, the Sumner's argument is that Congress should lead Reconstruction, and particularly after Lincoln's gone and Andrew Johnson takes office, he doesn't want Johnson to have any part of that. So there's a real battle, as you know, between Andrew Johnson and Charles Sumner. Sumner's a big factor in Andrew Johnson's ultimate impeachment.
Yeah.
But Sumner's argument, there's no blueprint for this, right? How to admit states back in. Sumner's argument was that Congress could form states and allow states to come in from the first place. They were territories, they become states, they have to, petition Congress. So if Congress can admit states, Congress can readmit states. And so that was his argument from the very beginning on that. Yeah. So it's you have military governments in all of the states to impose order. It was an incredible time,
Well, there's so many issues that we could kind of delve into, but I just want to make sure we get this one before we have to wrap it up. Is that he's not as famous as he was then, probably well known, I should say, and your book is probably going to help him. Maybe everyone know a little bit better about who he was. Why do you think that is, or what do you hope?
Yeah, it's interesting. And again, you have statues of Sumner, right? There's one in Cambridge, Harvard Square, where he's seated. There's the famous one on the public garden where he's standing with his jacket over his shoulder, and it just says Sumner on the monument. And because that's all you needed. That went up, I think, in 1897, and that's all you needed at the time. That everybody knew Sumner. And I think since then, with the exception of this David Donald period, 1960, 1970, he kind of falls off, and the abolitionist, I would even say the abolitionist history in Boston kind of falls off for a significant period. And I think when it's revived, when it comes back, you have like the movie Glory, that's about the Massachusetts 54th, and you have some of that. I think that resurrects some of it, but the Sumner piece just gets lost. It was astonishing to me that nothing really had been done on him in such a long time. So
I just watched the PBS American Experience. It was like three different episodes, and it's just like I think you said, except for the caning. I think that was it. Yeah, everything else is about Garrison and Douglas.
And it's funny because Garrison is very early in the game as an abolitionist, but Sumner there was a little bit of a rift between Sumner and Garrison too, right? Sumner thought Garrison was a bit of a show pony and not enough of a workhorse, I think might be the way I would put it. That he was in it a little bit for his own glory. And again, I'm not taking anything away from Garrison at all. But the other thing where they really differ, these two men, is Garrison's reflex action was, we need to destroy the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and start from scratch to get rid of slavery. Sumner's argument's the complete opposite. He said, no, those documents are the blueprints that show that all men are created equal. That's the way we're founded. We're founded in freedom. Freedom is national, slavery is sectional. That's how he went. That's how he said it, not vice versa. So those two differed, and Garrison comes around to Sumner's way of thinking late in the game. So
Well, and I also think a little bit like David McCullough helped with maybe John Adams' reputation. Maybe they'll make a movie.
We'll see. We'll see. That's always a good thing, Jim.
That would be a good thing. And some of your other books would be, good movies as well, right? So,
Thanks.
But so like I said, I've enjoyed it and enjoyed speaking. Thanks for coming on Author Talk today and discussing this. Was especially, I didn't mention before, in Abington, which is known for its abolitionist meetings here, and Frederick Douglass did visit here, and I know Sojourner Truth spoke at Island Grove here, as they did other places, but anyway, and Abington has abolitionist history. So, I know you speak at various places, including at our public library,
including Abington. Yes, always great. Abington's been very good to me.
Right,
I really appreciate it.
Great. Well, we appreciate you taking the time really to come on and speak with us here.
My pleasure.
And congratulations on the book, The Great Abolitionist, Charles Sumner and the Fight for a More Perfect Union. And can people get the book as we're speaking right now? It's not out. Maybe by the time.
Yeah, the book comes out April 23rd, so you'll be able to get it at bookstores everywhere, as the expression goes.
I did see on Amazon. I could order one right now.
You can pre-order
on Amazon.
Yep.
If you want to see Stephen in person, he'll be appearing at the James Library and Arts Center in Norwell, May 21st, as we mentioned at the beginning. But also, as I noticed on your great website, was it StephenPuleo.com?
It is, yes. And thank you for the compliment.
You're welcome. That it was very easy to see other places you'll be appearing. I know I saw Hull, you said, is a a favorite location for when you open.
I'll be debuting The Great Abolitionist at Hull on May 2nd, so that's exciting. Thanks for the kind words about the website.
Yep.
We work really hard at that. All the events are there, a lot of fresh content there, so I think it's a place people can visit if they want to learn more.
Great. Okay, and I think we pretty much covered. It was a good dive in there. I really appreciate it. Really enjoyed it.
We could talk for hours, but I think we did. Thanks so much, Jim.
Thanks a lot.
Yep.
And thanks for everyone tuning in to Author Talk. We'll see you next time.